Welcome to this reader response edition of Forthright. Last week, my column subject was police reform, and before I read the September 16th column headlined The Trust Gap, I want you to think about how you have interacted with the police in your life. What's your lived experience? Here's a few stories from mine. Dispatch pages us to an unknown medical call. A young woman believes she is fighting the devil himself. Snared in drug addiction and living with mental health challenges most of us cannot even imagine, she has called 911. The responding police, fire, and EMS personnel spend hours trying to coax her into the ambulance she has summoned. The deputies keep the conversation calm as we all pace in the middle of the road, protecting her from potential harm, taking all the time needed for a safe outcome. Safe, at least for the next 24 hours, since the healthcare system really has nothing to offer. We all know she will be released. We know we will be back, and I am grateful for the deputies' training and the backup they provide. Another day, and another page, this time to an address that has recently been publicized in the weekly newspaper as the residence of a registered sex offender. Our dispatcher describes a possibly life-threatening trauma and has a helicopter on standby. Turns out the information from the caller to the dispatch center was a bit panicky and helicopter transport could be canceled. Still a touchy situation. The scene ended without incident, and the patient was transported by ground ambulance. It was comforting to have a deputy there providing an air of authority, especially when it was reported the next day in the newspaper that our patient had been arrested at the hospital for assaulting several healthcare workers in Spokane. Homelessness and housing insecurity present differently in the country than in the city, but the root problems of addiction and mental health are the same. Every rural EMT knows the addresses where you want to hear the words, "Law enforcement is on scene," before you set foot out of your own vehicle. The places where we can't be sure who is around the corner, or where merely the presence of a deputy calms the fighting spirit of bystanders. We depend on our deputies to literally have our backs. I became an EMT and first responder over 30 years ago. My lived experience shapes my worldview of police reform, just as each one of us is shaped by our own experience. So now you know my bias, the context for this column as published on September 16th. A dozen new laws revising and extending existing RCWs were intended to address a lack of trust between some community members and the officers hired to serve and protect them. For those who see all institutions as systemically racist, the solution to their fear was to legislatively limit officers' discretion and increase officers' liability. From a law enforcement point of view, as expressed by the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs in their July 31st newsletter, the resulting laws had significant gray areas. Officers are now to be held to a standard of care set by state-approved policies yet to be written, based on guidance and clarifications from the Attorney General not expected until 2022. It feels like a setup to fail. There's a lack of trust on both sides, and you can't legislate trust. At a presentation on September 10th to the Spokane Business and Commercial Property Council, Senator Andy Billig from Spokane described the overall goal as adding transparency and accountability, continuing to build trust between public and police, reduce the use of force, and keep both public and law enforcement officers as safe as possible. It's a lot of change all at once, said Billig. He pointed to the overwhelming voter support for Spokane's police ombudsman to provide local accountability, and Billig emphasized his respect for the vital work of the police and will continue to press for clarifications from the Attorney General. Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich's presentation at the same meeting described the frustration from many law enforcement agencies with the lack of clarity on the new standards. Quote, "People think de-escalation is something new, been part of our training for 32 years. The definition of a successful operation is no one gets hurt, not the suspect, the community, or us. De-escalation happens all the time," end quote. Even HB 1310's sponsor, Representative Jesse Johnson, a Democrat from Federal Way, admitted, quote, The vast majority of officers are already abiding by the standards codified in this new law, end quote, in his July 23rd statement on implementation. So what's the problem? Legal interpretations on new laws differ. Nothing is ever final until it's been litigated. And no certified police officer wants to find themselves selected by a camera-wielding bystander to be the test case. Both Billig and Knezevich acknowledged more officers will be required to establish probable cause, a specific legal standard higher than the reasonable suspicion standard that has been used to detain someone for questioning until a situation has been sorted out. Sometimes this may just take a few minutes of conversation once an officer arrives on scene. However, it has already resulted in at least one resource-intensive manhunt in Spokane, when a reasonably suspicious suspect fled before probable cause could be established. With an already inadequate workforce spread thinner, plus cautious advice from counsel, many agencies have pulled back response to community service calls like mental health or welfare checks. And to be fair, the lawyers advising them are just doing their jobs, giving their law enforcement clients advice on the best practices to reduce exposure to liability. An August 2nd memo from the Office of the Attorney General sought to clarify, concluding, HB 1310 does not prohibit peace officers from responding to community caretaking calls, including mental health calls. That's the quote from the memo. The problem is the disclaimer at the bottom of the memo. Quote, "This is not a formal opinion of the Attorney General," end quote. And we're back to the trust issue. HB 1310, in its statement of legislative intent, says the goal is to eliminate, quote, "excessive force and discriminatory policing by establishing a requirement for peace officers to act with reasonable care when carrying out their duties," end quote. But reasonable people may disagree over what reasonable means. The fear is that merely grasping an elbow to direct a disoriented person in a mental health crisis could later be used as the basis of a complaint, not to a local ombudsman, but to a state-appointed 5-member panel with 2 actively certified law enforcement officers and 3 members of the public with an interest in police accountability. The panel would have authority to pull certification from any officer and end their career. Unsurprisingly, officers have a low level of trust in a lopsided panel deliberately disconnected from their community. No other profession tasked with protecting the public health, safety, and welfare would stand for this kind of accountability. Appointed licensing boards in nursing, architecture, engineering, and other critical professions have a majority of practitioners with 1 or 2 public members. Steve Strachan, WASPIC Executive Director, responded by email to a request for comment. While the Sheriffs and Police Chiefs Association is, quote, "pleased to see the Attorney General's office agree with our interpretation," quote, end quote, that agencies can continue to respond to community caretaking calls, he emphasized, quote, "neither WASPIC nor the Attorney General's office provides legal advice to local law enforcement agencies. Each department has its own legal counsel," end quote. And he also pointed out the question goes beyond responding to the call. Quote, "simply showing up to the scene of a call provides little consolation if the officer is not able to take actions necessary to address the problems. Comments, statements of good intentions, and interpretations by advocates, legislators, or others have no legal effect on what the law says or how agencies must abide by it," end quote. Until the legislature reconvenes in January, law enforcement and the fire and EMS personnel who rely on them for de-escalation and backup will be gingerly trying to balance their duties to care for the public and protect their own safety. As one first responder frustrated at the pullback from law enforcement recently said, "Who the hell thought this was a good idea?" The night before that presentation by Senator Andy Billig and Sheriff Ozzie Knezevich to the Spokane Business and Commercial Property Council, I had attended our regularly monthly EMS training meeting. On that particular Thursday night, we had a briefing on how the new police reform bills would affect our local law enforcement. Like many other departments, officers would now stand back and stand by on EMS calls, responding into the scene only after a potential crime is committed. Instead of an officer standing in the corner of the room quietly providing a calming air of authority, the officer could respond only after something like an assault. We heard officers would not be dispatched to welfare checks or bizarre behavior, but 911 dispatchers have to send somebody, and that somebody will be fire and EMS personnel. Maybe that doesn't matter as much in a city with a paid fire department staff on duty 24/7. But in rural fire districts, it means interrupting work and families to handle situations we are not as well trained for, and extra time spent generating a frustrating amount of paperwork to fill state databases. And potentially, a deputy responding to an assault on healthcare workers instead of preventing one by his or her presence. The limitations our partners in the sheriff's office would be operating under would affect me, and I was not happy about it. And so I quoted my own reaction at the end of the evening. It's a frustrating situation for everybody. As I wrote the column, I realized the problem was lack of trust between those whose experiences and interactions with the police had too often been negative and those who had experienced the value of good officers in their community. And if your experience has been traffic tickets, when my daughter was a young driver, I lectured her about the importance of pulling over promptly and keeping her hands in plain sight on the steering wheel. A traffic stop is a high-stress situation for an officer, an easy ambush. Once I was traveling with an unpredictable Beagle Basset rescue dog named Alfred in the passenger seat of my car as I entered a small town. I was tired, and I had missed the reduced speed sign at the edge of town, only realizing my mistake when the red and blue flashing lights went off behind me. I pulled over promptly, and then I made a mistake. I took my hands off the wheel, leaning over to the right and reaching for Alfred. I didn't trust him not to lunge across me and bite the approaching stranger. As I got hold of Alfred's collar, I glanced back over in the side mirror to see the officer approaching with his eyes narrowed and hand on his weapon, as he should. Fortunately, the officer was a dog lover and figured out the situation quickly as I apologized profusely. But he had no way of knowing if I was fishing a gun out of the glove box, my wallet out of my purse, or securing an unpredictable dog. The officer had no reason to trust me, an ordinary white woman in an ordinary dusty car in an ordinary small town. Community trust and police reform are problems for everybody, and there are no partisan points to be scored. The best reaction to the column I received was the one from Spokane Police Chief Craig Meidel. He said, "Thank you for keeping this topic at the forefront of discussions. This is so important at so many levels." And while you can't legislate trust, you can only build it by respecting how the world looks from both sides. Thank you for joining me on Forthright.